Hi everyone, Kate here for the next day of Quarantine Ghost Stories. I am reading out of the Virago book of Victorian Ghost Stories, and we will be continuing on with a story which was called Winthrop's Adventure. Yes, Winthrop's Adventure. So we had read the first two chapters, and now we will be reading the third chapter, and this is a story by Vernon Lee. My very first work I've ever read by Vernon Lee. I returned to M the next year on my way to Venice and stopped a couple of days in the old place, having to bargain for certain Renaissance carved work, which a friend wished to buy. It was midsummer. The fields which I had left planted with cabbages and covered with white frost were tawny with ripe corn, and the vine garlands drooped down to kiss the tall, compact green hemp. The dark streets were reeking with heat. The people were all sprawling about under colonnade and awning. It was the end of June in Lombardy, God's own orchard on earth. I went to old Fa Diesi's palace to ask whether he had any commissions for Venice. He might indeed be in the country, but the picture, the portrait, was at his palace, and that was enough for me. I had often thought of it in the winter, and I wondered whether now, with the sun blazing through every chink, I should still be impressed by it as I had been in the gloomy autumn. Fa Diesi's was at home and overjoyed to see me. He jumped and frisked about like a figure in the dance of death, in intense excitement about certain MSS he had lately seen. He narrated, or rather acted, for it was all in the present tense and accompanied by appropriate gestures, a journey he had recently made to Guastalla to see a psaltery at a monastery, how he had bargained for a post-chaise, how the post-chaise had upset halfway, how he had sworn at the driver, how he had rung dring, dring at the monastery door, how he cunningly pretended to be in quest of an old valueless crucifix, how the monks had had the impudence to ask 150 francs for it, how he had hummed and hawed at the pretending suddenly to notice the psaltery, had asked what it was, etc., as if he did not know, and finally struck the bargain for both crucifix and psaltery for 150 francs. A psaltery of the year 1310 for 150 francs. And those idiots of monks were quite overjoyed. They thought they had cheated me, and he frisked about in ecstasy of pride and triumph. We had got to the well-known door. It was open. I could see the portrait. The sun streamed brightly on the brown face and light-powdered locks. I know not how. I felt a momentary giddiness and sickness, as if of long-desired, unexpected pleasure. It lasted but an instant, and I was ashamed of myself. Fa Diesi's was in splendid spirits. "Do you see that?" he said, forgetting all he had previously told me. "That is a certain Ferdinando Rinaldi, a singer, who was assassinated for making love to my great-aunt, and he stalked about in great glee, thinking of the psaltery at Guastalla, and fanning himself complacently with a large green fan. A thought suddenly struck me. It happened here, did it not? To be sure." And Fa Diesi's continued shuffling to and fro in his old red and blue dressing gown, with parrots and cherry branches on it. "Did you never know anyone who had seen him? Heard him?" "I? Never. How could I? He was killed 94 years ago." 94 years ago? I looked up at the portrait. 94 years ago? And yet the eyes seemed to me to have a strange, fixed, intent look. And where? I hesitated despite myself. Where did it happen? That few people know. No one, probably, except me nowadays, he answered with satisfaction. But my father pointed out the house to me when I was little. It had belonged to Marchese Negri, but somehow or other, after that affair, no one would live there any longer, and it was left to rot. Already, when I was a child, I was all deserted and falling to pieces. A fine house, though, a fine house, and one which ought to have been worth something. I saw it again some years ago. I rarely go outside the gates now. Outside Porta San Vitale, about a mile. Outside Porta San Vitale? The house where this Rinaldi was? Is it still there? Fa Diesi's looked at me with intense contempt. "Bagatella!" he exclaimed. "Do you think a villa flies away like that? You are sure?" "Per Bacco! As sure as I see you. Outside Porta San Vitale, an old tumble-down place with obelisks and vases and that sort of thing." We had come to the head of the staircase. "Goodbye," I said. "I'll return tomorrow for your parcels for Venice." And I ran down the stair. "Outside Porta San Vitale," I said to myself. Outside Porta San Vitale. It was 6 in the afternoon, and the heat was still intense. I hailed a crazy old cab, a sky blue carriage of the year 20 with a cracked hood and emblazoned panels. Dove comanda? Whither do you command? Asked the sleepy driver. Outside Porta San Vitale, I cried. He touched his bony, long-maned white horse, and off we jolted over the uneven pavement, past the red Lombard Cathedral and Baptistry, through the long, dark Via San Vitale, with its grand old palaces, under the red gate with the old word Libertas still on it, along a dusty road bordered by acacias out into the rich Lombard plain. On we rattled through the fields of corn, hemp, and glossy dark maize, ripening under the rich evening sun. In the distance, the purple walls and belfries and shining cupolas gleaming in the light beyond, the vast blue and gold and hazy plain, bounded by the far-off Alps. The air was warm and serene, everything quiet and solemn, but I was excited. I sought out every large country house. I went wherever a tall Belvedere tower peeped from behind the elms and poplars. I crossed and recrossed the plain, taking one lane after another, as far as where the road branched off to Crèvecœur, past villa after villa, but found none with vases and obelisks, none crumbling and falling, none that could have been the villa. What wonder indeed, if Fa-Diézes had seen it? But Fa-Diézes was 70, and that had happened 94 years ago. Still, I might be mistaken. I might have gone too far, or not far enough. There was lane within lane and road within road. Perhaps the house was screened by trees, or perhaps it lay towards the next gate. So I went again, and through the cyclamen-lined lanes, overhung by gnarled mulberries and oaks, I looked up at one house after another. All were old, many dilapidated, some seeming old churches with walled-up colonnades, others built up against old watchtowers, but of what old Fa-Diézes had described, I could see nothing. I asked the driver, and the driver asked the old woman and the fair-haired children who crowded out of the little farms. Did anyone know of a large deserted house with obelisks and vases? A house that had once belonged to a Marchese Negri? Not in that neighborhood. There was the Villa Montecassinioli, with the tower and the sundial, which was dilapidated enough, and the Casino Fava crumbling in yonder cabbage field, but neither had vases nor obelisks. Neither had ever belonged to a Marchese Negri. At last I gave up in despair. 94 years ago. The house no longer existed, so I returned to my inn, where the three jolly medieval pilgrims swung over the door lamp, took my supper, and tried to forget the whole matter. Next day I went and finally settled with the owner of the carved work I had been commissioned to buy. And then I sauntered lazily about the old town. The day after there was to be a great fair, and preparations were being made for it. Baskets and hampers being unloaded, and stalls put up everywhere in the great square. Festoons of tinware and garlands of onions were slung across the Gothic arches of the town hall, and to its massive bronze torch holders there was a quack already holding forth on the top of his stagecoach, with a skull and many bottles before him, and a little bespangled page handing about his bills. There was a puppet show at a corner, with a circle of empty chairs round it, just under the stone pulpit where the monks of the Middle Ages had once exhorted the Montagues and Capulets to make peace and embrace. I sauntered about among the crockery and glassware, picking my way among the packing cases and hay, and among the vociferating peasants and townsfolk. I looked at the figs and cherries and red peppers in the baskets, at the old ironwork, rusty keys, nails, chains, bits of ornament on the stalls, at the vast blue and green glazed umbrellas, at the old prints and images of saints tied against the church bench, at the whole moving, quarreling, gesticulating crowd. I bought an old silver death's head trinket at the table of a perambulating watchmaker, and some fresh sweet peas and roses from a peasant woman selling fowls and turkeys. Then I turned into the maze of quaint little paved streets, protected by chains from carts and carriages, and named after medieval hostelries, and labeled on little slabs, Scimmia, which means monkey, or Alemanna, which means Germany, Venetia, and most singular of all, Brocha in Drosso, jug on the back. Behind the great, red, time-stained, castle-like town hall were a number of tinkers' dens, and beneath it, arches hung cauldrons, pitchers, saucepans, and immense pudding molds with the imperial eagle of Austria on them, capacious and ancient enough to have contained the pudding of generations of German Caesars. Then I poked into some of those wondrous curiosity shops, little black dens where oaken presses contain heaps and heaps of brocaded dresses and embroidered waistcoats and yards of lace and splendid chasubles. the spoils of centuries of magnificence. I walked down the main street and saw a crowd collected round a man with an immense white-crested owl. The creature was such a splendid one. I determined to buy him and keep him in my studio at Venice. But when I approached him, he flew at me, shaking his wings and screeching so that I beat an ignominious retreat. At length I returned to the square and sat down beneath the awning, where the two bare-legged urchins served me excellent snow and lemon juice, at the price of a sou the glass. In short, I enjoyed my last day amazingly, and in this bright sunny square, with all the bustle about me, I wondered whether the person who the previous evening had scoured the country in search of a crazy villa where a man had been assassinated 94 years ago could really and truly have been myself. So I spent the morning and the afternoon I passed indoors, packing up the delicate carved work with my own hands. Although the perspiration ran down my face and I gasped for air, at length, when evening and coolness were approaching, I took my hat and went once more to Fa Diesi's palace. I found the old fellow in his many-colored dressing gown, seated in his cool, dusky room, among his inlaid lutes and Cremonese vials, carefully mending the torn pages of an illuminated missal, while his old witch-like housekeeper was cutting out and pasting labels onto a heap of manuscript scores on the table. Fa Diesis got up and jumped about ecstatically, made magnificent speeches, and said that since I insisted on being of use to him, he had prepared half a dozen letters, which I might kindly leave on various correspondents of his at Venice, in order to save the 2-penny stamp for each. The grim, lank old fellow, with his astounding dressing gown and cap, his lantern-jawed housekeeper, his old morose gray cat, and his splendid harpsichords and lutes and missals, amused me more than usual. I sat with him for some time while he patched away at his missal. Mechanically, I turned over the yellow pages of a music book that lay, waiting for a label, under my hand, and mechanically, my eye fell on the words in faded yellow ink at the top of one of the pieces, the indication of its performer, Signor Fernando Rinaldi, Parma, 1782. I positively started, for somewhere that whole business had gone out of my mind. "What have you got there?" asked Fa Diesis, perhaps a little suspiciously, and leaning across the table, he twitched the notes toward me. "Oh, only that old opera of Cimarosa's. Ah, by the way, per Baccio, how could I have made such a mistake yesterday? Didn't I tell you that Rinaldi had been stabbed in a villa outside Porta San Vitale?" "Yes," I cried eagerly. "Why?" "Why? I can't conceive how, but I must have been thinking about that blessed psaltery at San Vitale at Guastalla. The villa where Rinaldi was killed is outside Porta San Zaccaria, in the direction of the river, near that old monastery where there are those frescoes by, I forget the fellow's name, that all the foreigners go to see. Don't you know?" "Ah!" I exclaimed. "I understand." And I did understand, for Porta San Zaccaria happens to be at exactly the opposite end of town to Porta San Vitale. And here was the explanation of my unsuccessful search of the previous evening. So after all, the house might still be standing, and the desire to see it again seized hold of me. I rose, took the letters, which I strongly suspected contained other letters whose postage was to be saved in the same way, by being delivered by the original correspondent, and prepared to depart. "Goodbye, goodbye," said old Fa Diesis with effusion, as we passed through the dark passage in order to get the staircase. "Continue, my dear friend, in those paths of wisdom and culture which the youth of our days has so miserably abandoned, in order that the sweet promise of your happy silver youth be worthily accomplished in your riper— by the way," he interrupted himself, "I've forgotten to give you a little pamphlet of mine on the manufacture of violin strings, which I wish to send as an act of reverence to my old friend, the commander of the garrison of Venice." And off he scuttled. I was near the door up the 3 steps and could not resist the temptation of seeing the picture once more. I pushed open the door and entered. A long ray of declining sunlight, reflected from the neighboring red church tower, fell across the face of the portrait, playing in the light, powdered hair, and on the downy, well-cut lips, and ending in a tremulous crimson stain on the boarded floor. I went close up to the picture. There was the name, Fernando Rinaldi, 1782. On the roll of music he was holding, but the notes themselves were mere imitative, meaningless smears and blotches, although the title of the piece stood distinct and legible, "Sea Regina io Pastor Sone." "Why, where is he?" cried Fa Diesis' shrill voice in the passage. "Ah, here you are!" And he handed me the pamphlet, pompously addressed to the illustrious General S. at Venice. I put it in my pocket. "You won't forget to deliver it?" he asked, and then went on with the speech he had before begun. Let the promise of your happy silver youth be fulfilled in a golden manhood, in order that the world may mark down your name, Albo Lapillo. Ah, he continued, perhaps we shall never meet again. I am old, my dear friend, I am old, and he smacked his lips. Perhaps when you return, I may have gone to rest with my immortal ancestors, who, as you know, intermarried with the ducal family of Sforza, A.D. 1490. The last time? This might be the last time I saw the picture. What would become of it after old Fadisi's death? I turned once more towards it. Leaving the room, the last flicker of light fell on the dark, yearning face, and it seemed in the trembling sunbeam as if the head turned and looked towards me. I never saw the portrait again. I walked along quickly through the darkening streets, on through the crowd of loiterers and pleasure-seekers, on towards Porta San Zaccaria. It was late, but if I hastened, I might still have an hour of twilight, and next morning I had to leave. This was my last opportunity. I could not relinquish it. So on I went, heedless of the ominous puffs of warm, damp air and of the rapidly clouding sky. It was St. John's Eve, and bonfires began to appear on the little hills round the town. Fire balloons were sent up, and the great bell of the cathedral boomed out in honor of the coming holiday. I threaded my way through the dusty streets and out by Porta San Zaccaria. I walked smartly along the avenues of poplars along the walls, and then cut across into the fields by a lane leading towards the river. Behind me were the city walls, all crenellated and jagged. In front, the tall belfry and cypresses of the Carthusian monastery. Above, the starless, moonless sky, overhung by heavy clouds. The air was mild and relaxing. Every now and then, there came a gust of hot, damp wind, making a shudder run across the silver poplars and trailed vines. A few heavy drops fell, admonishing me of the coming storm, and every moment some of the light faded away. But I was determined. Was not this my last opportunity? So on I stumbled through the rough lane, on through the fields of corn and sweet, fresh-scented hemp, the fireflies dancing in fantastic spirals before me. Something dark wriggled across my path. I caught it on my stick. It was a long, slimy snake, which slipped quickly off. The frogs roared for rain. The crickets sawed with ominous loudness. The fireflies crossed and recrossed before me. Yet on I went, quicker and quicker in the fast increasing darkness. A broad sheet of pink lightning and a distant rumble. More drops fell. The frogs roared louder. The crickets sawed faster and faster. The air got heavier and the sky yellow and lurid where the sun had set. Yet on I went towards the river. Suddenly, down came a tremendous stream of rain, as if the heavens had opened, and with it down came the darkness, complete though sudden. The storm had changed evening into the deepest night. What should I do? Return? How? I saw a light glimmering behind a dark mass of trees. I would go on. There must be a house out there where I could take shelter till the storm was over. I was too far to get back to the town, so on I went in the pelting rain. The lane made a sudden bend, and I found myself in an open space in the midst of the fields before an iron gate, behind which, surrounded by trees, rose a dark, vast mass. A rent in the clouds permitted me to distinguish a gaunt gray villa with broken obelisks on its triangular front. My heart gave a great thump. I stopped. The rain continued to stream down. A dog began to bark furiously from a little peasant's house on the other side of the road, whence issued the light I had perceived. The door opened, and a man appeared holding a lamp. "Who's there?" he cried. I went up to him. He held up the light and surveyed me. "Ah," he said immediately, "a stranger, a foreigner. Pray enter il trusimo." My dress and my sketchbook had immediately revealed what I was. He took me for an artist, and one of the many who had visited the neighboring Carthusian abbey, who had lost his way in the maze of little lanes. I shook the rain off and entered the low room, whose whitewashed walls were lit yellow by a kitchen fire. A picturesque group of peasants stood out in black outline on the luminous background. An old woman was spinning on her classic distaff. A young one was unraveling skeins of thread on a sort of rotating star. Another was cracking pea pods. An old close-shaven man sat smoking with his elbows on the table, and opposite to him sat a portly priest in three-cornered hat, knee breeches, and short coat. They rose and looked at me, and welcomed me with the familiar courtesy of their class. The priest offered me his seat. The girl took my soaking coat and hat and hung them over the fire. The young man brought an immense hempen towel and proceeded to dry me, much to the general hilarity. They had been reading their usual stories of Charlemagne in their well-thumbed Reale di Francia, that encyclopedia of Italian peasants. But they put by their books on my entrance and began talking, questioning me on every possible and impossible subject. Was it true that it always rained in England? At that rate, remarked the old man shrewdly, how could the English grow grapes? And if they did not make wine, what could they live on? Was it true that one could pick up lumps of gold somewhere in England? Was there any town as large as this one in that country? Etc., etc. The priest thought these questions foolish, and inquired with much gravity after the health of my Lord Wellington, who, he understood, had been seriously unwell of late. I scarcely listened. I was absent and preoccupied. I gave the woman my sketchbook to look over. They were all delighted with its contents, mistook all the horses for oxen, and all the men for women, and exclaimed and tittered with much glee. The priest, who prided himself on superior education, gave me the blandish encouragements about whether I had been to the new picture gallery, whether I had been to the neighboring Bologna. He was very proud of having been there last St. Petronius's day. Informed me that the city was the mother of all art, and that Karachi especially were her most glorious sons, etc. Meanwhile, the rain continued coming down in a steady pour. I don't think I shall be able to get home tonight, said the priest, looking through the window into the darkness. My donkey is the most wonderful donkey in the world, quite a human being. When you say, Leone, Leone, to him, he kicks up his heels and stands on his hind legs like an acrobat. Indeed he does, upon my honor. But I don't believe even he could find his way through this darkness, and the wheels of my gig would infallibly stick in some rut, and where should I be then? I must stay here overnight, no help for that. But I'm sorry for the signore here, who will indeed find these quarters very poor. Indeed, I said, I shall be but too happy to stay, if I be sure that I shall be in no one's way. In our way? What a notion! They all cried. That's it, said the priest, particularly proud of the little vehicle he drove, after the droll fashion of the Lombard clergyman. And I'll drive the signore into town tomorrow morning, and you can bring your cart with the vegetables for the fair. I paid but little attention to all this. I felt sure I had at length found the object of my search. There, over the way, was the villa. But I seemed almost as far from it as ever, sealed in this bright whitewashed kitchen among these country folk. The young man asked me timidly, and as a special favor, to make a picture of the girl who was his bride, and very pretty, with laughing, irregular features and curly, crisp, golden hair. I took out my pencil and began. I fear not as conscientiously as these good people deserved, but they were enchanted, and stood in a circle round me, exchanging whispered remarks, while the girl sat all giggling and restless on the large wooden settle. "What a night!" exclaimed the old man. "What a bad night, and St. John's Eve, too!" "What has that to do with it?" I asked. "Why," he answered, "they say that on St. John's night they permit dead people to walk about." "What rubbish!" cried the priest indignantly. "Who ever told you that? What is there about ghosts in the Mass book, or even in the Archbishop's pastorals, or in the Holy Fathers of the Church?" And he raised his voice to inquisitorial dignity. "You may say what you like," answered the old man doggedly. "It's true, none the less. I've never seen anything myself, and perhaps the Archbishop hasn't either. But I know people who have." The priest was about to fall upon him with a deluge of arguments in dialect when I interrupted. "To whom does that large house over the way belong?" I waited with anxiety for an answer. "It belongs to Avvocato Bargellini," said the woman with great deference, and they proceeded to inform me that they were his tenants, his contadini having charge of all the property belonging to the house, that Avvocato Bargellini was immensely rich and immensely learned. "An encyclopedic man," burst out the priest. "He knows everything. Law, art, geography, mathematics, numismatics, gymnastics," and he waved his hand between each branch of knowledge. I was disappointed. "Is it inhabited?" I asked. "No," they answered. "No one has ever lived in it. The Avvocato bought it 20 years ago from the heir of a certain Marchese Negri, who died very poor." "Our Marchese Negri?" I exclaimed. After all, I was right. "But why is it not inhabited, and since when?" "Oh, since always. No one has ever lived in it since the Marchese Negri's grandfather. It's all going to pieces. We keep our garden tools and a few sacks there, but there is no living there. There are no windows or shutters." "But why doesn't the Avvocato patch it up?" I persisted. "It seems a very fine house." The old man was going to answer, but the priest glanced at him and answered quickly. "The position in these fields is unhealthy." "Unhealthy?" cried the old man angrily, much annoyed at the priest's interference. Unhealthy? Why, haven't I lived here these 60 years and not one of us has had a headache? Unhealthy indeed. No, the house is a bad house to live in. That's what it is. This is very odd, I said. Surely there must be ghosts? And I tried to laugh. The word ghosts acted like magic. Like all Italian peasants, they loudly disclaimed such a thing when questioned, although they would accidentally refer to it themselves. Ghosts? Ghosts? They cried. Surely the signore does not believe in such trash. Rats there are, and in plenty. Do ghosts gnaw the chestnuts and steal the Indian corn? Even the old man, who had seemed inclined to be ghostly from a rebellion to the priest, was now thoroughly on his guard, and not a word about ghosts, and I, for my part, did not want to hear about them. For in my present highly wrought imaginative mood, an apparition in a winding sheet, a clanking of chains, and all the authorized ghostly manifestations seemed in the highest degree disgusting. My mind was too much haunted to be intruded on by vulgar specters, and I mechanically sketched the giggling, blushing little peasant girl, and looked up in her healthy, rosy, sunburnt face, peeping from beneath a gaudy silk kerchief. My mental eyes were fixed on a very different face, which I saw as distinctly as hers, that dark, yearning face with the strange red lips and the lightly powdered locks. The peasants and the priest went on chattering gaily, running from one topic to another, the harvest, the vines, the next day's fair, politics, the most fantastic, scraps of historical lore, even more astounding, rattling on unceasingly with much good humor, the most astonishing ignorance of facts, infantile absurdity, perfect seriousness, and much shrewd skeptical humor. I did my best to join in this conversation and laughed and joked to the best of my power. The fact is, I felt quite happy and serene, for I had, little by little, made up my mind to an absurd step, either babyish in the extreme or foolhardy to the utmost, but which I contemplated with perfect coolness and assurance, as one sometimes does hazardous or foolish courses, which gratify a momentary whim. I had at length found the house. I would pass the night there. I must have been in violent mental excitement, but the excitement was so uniform and unimpeded as to seem almost regular. I felt as if it were quite natural to live in an atmosphere of weirdness and adventure, and I was firm in my purpose. At length came the moment for action. The women put by their work. The old man shook the ashes out of his pipe. They looked at each other, as if not knowing how to begin. The priest, who had just re-entered from giving his wondrous donkey some hay, made himself their spokesman. Ahem! He cleared his throat. The signore must excuse the extreme simplicity of these uneducated rustics, and bear in mind that they are as unaccustomed to the luxuries of cities, and have, moreover, to be up by daybreak in order to attend to their agricultural— Yes, I answered, smiling. I understand. They want to go to bed, and they are quite right. I must beg you all to forgive my having thoughtlessly kept you up so late. How was I now to proceed? I scarcely understood. Keep them up late? Oh, not at all. They had been but too honored. They cried. Well, said the priest, who was growing sleepy, of course there is no returning through this rain. The lanes are too unsafe. Besides, the city gates are locked. Come, what can we do for the signore? Can we make him up a bed here? I will go and sleep with our old meso. And he tapped the young man's shoulder. The women were already starting off for pillows and mattresses and what not, but I stopped them. On no account, I said. I will not encroach upon your hospitality. I can sleep quite comfortably over the way in the large house. Over the way? In the big house? They cried all together. The signore sleeps in the big house? Oh, never, never! Impossible! Rather than that, I'll harness my donkey and drive the signore through the mud and rain and darkness. That I will, Corpo di Baccio, cried the little red-faced priest. But why not? I answered, determined not to be balked. I can get a splendid night's rest over the way. Why shouldn't I? Never, never! They answered in a chorus of expostulation. But since there are no ghosts here, I protested, trying to laugh, what reason is there against it? Oh, as to ghosts, put in the priest, I promise you, there are none. I snap my fingers at ghosts. Well, I persisted, you won't tell me that the rats will mistake me for a sack of chestnuts and eat me up, will you? Come, give me the key. I was beginning to believe in the use of a little violence. Which is that? I asked, seeing a bunch hanging on a nail. Is it this one? Or this one? Via, tell me which it is. The old man seized hold of the keys. You must not sleep there, he said very positively. It's no use trying to hide it. That house is no house for a Christian to sleep in. A bad thing happened there once. Someone was murdered. That is why no one will live in it. It's no use to say. No abate. and he turned contemptuously towards the priest. There are evil things in that house. Ghosts? I cried, laughing and trying to force the keys from him. Not exactly ghosts, he answered, but the devil is sometimes in that house. Indeed, I exclaimed, quite desperate. That is just what I want. I have to paint a picture of him fighting with a saint of ours who once pulled his nose with a pair of tongs, and I am overjoyed to do his portrait from the life. They did not well understand. They suspected I was mad, and so, truly, I was. Let him have his way, grumbled the old man. He is a headstrong boy. Let him go and see and hear all he will. For heaven's sake, signore, entreated the women. Is it possible, Signora Forestier, that you can be serious? Protested the priest with his hand on my arm. Indeed I am, I answered. You shall hear all I have seen tomorrow morning. I'll throw my black paint at the devil if he won't sit still while I paint him. Paint the devil? Is he mad? Whispered the women aghast. I had got hold of the keys. Is this it? I asked, pointed to a heavy, handsomely wrought but very rusty key. The old man nodded. I took it off the ring. The women, although extremely terrified by my daring, were secretly delighted at the prospect of a good story the next morning. One of them gave me a large, two-wicked kitchen lamp with snuffers and tweezers chained to its tall stand. Another brought an immense rose-colored umbrella. The young man produced a large mantle lined with green and thick coarse cloth. They would have brought a mattress and blankets if I had let them. You insist on going? Asked the priest. Think how wretchedly cold and damp it must be over there. Do pray reflect, signore, entreated the young woman. Haven't I told you I am engaged to paint the devil's portrait? I answered, and, drawing the bolt, opening the umbrella, I dashed out of the cottage. Je suis Maria, cried the women, to go there on such a night as this! To sleep on the floor! Exclaimed the priest. What a man! What a man! Imatto! He is mad! They all joined and shut the door. I dashed across the flood before the door, unlocked the iron gate, walked quickly through the dark, and went up the avenue of moaning poplars. A sudden flash of lightning, broad, pink, and enduring, permitted me to see the house, like an immense stranded ship or huge grim skeleton looming in the darkness. I ran up the steps, unlocked the door, and gave it a violent shake. So that ends the reading for today. And on Monday, hopefully, if everything goes according to plan, is when I will finish it. There's just one chapter left. So I just really love when you read Victorian ghost stories. Sometimes it takes a while for things to get started, and she's really setting things up slowly but surely. So now we're finally where he's gotten to this old house. And so we're going to find out what happens to him while he's in this house. And I'm really eager to know what's going to happen next. I hope you enjoyed that next part of Winthrop's adventure, and I will be back for another video soon. Bye.